This happened when I was working part-time at a ramen restaurant. I got the job when I was around 16 years old. During my early years of high school, in my hometown of Kanazawa, in the Ishikawa prefecture, the ramen shop was inside a shopping mall, and I worked almost every weekend after school, serving customers and operating the cash register. I usually started around 7 and worked until midnight, sometimes staying late to clean and close up. Normally, there was a row of seats in front of the register for anyone in the mall to use if they needed to rest. They weren't just for customers of our restaurant. My experience happened about a year and a half after I started working there, so I was 17 at the time. For context, I'm a woman. One day, during a break in my shift, my manager and a coworker approached me and asked, "Do you have an older friend around here?" I felt a bit confused by the question, but I quickly said no because I didn't want to deal with any weird questions like that. Both my manager and coworker shook their heads, which seemed like a sign of disagreement or surprise. I wasn't sure which. Then my manager said, "I see." I had no idea why they asked me that or what they were talking about, so I just went back to work and forgot about it. A few weeks later, my coworker approached me and asked, "Can you go to the bathroom and come back?" It felt strange, and I stood there confused until the manager came over. When I asked them why they wanted me to do that, neither of them gave me a proper answer, and the manager just said, "It's okay. It's just an experiment. You can go and come back quickly." I did what they asked. I went to the bathroom and returned. I didn't understand the point of the so-called experiment. After spending a few seconds in the bathroom, I came back and saw worried looks on their faces. My manager frowned and said, "I think an older man is following you." At first, I didn't understand what they meant. I guess because I was young and a little naive, I couldn't process why an older man would follow me. So I asked them. Both of them subtly glanced toward a row of seats, and I followed their gaze to see an older man sitting there, looking in our direction. As soon as he noticed I was looking, he turned his head. I had no idea who he was, but I felt pretty scared. He had clearly been watching us. I asked my coworkers why they thought he was following me. I mean, sitting outside the shop didn't exactly seem like following. I wasn't sure, so I let them explain. "Well, every time you're on shift, the guy sits right there and watches you. When you leave the shop to go to the bathroom, he also gets up and starts following you. It seems like he's stalking you." That terrified me, but not in the way a ghost story would. Like people say, humans are scarier than ghosts. I looked at him again, wanting to make sure I didn't know him. As I studied his face, I realized he was a complete stranger to me, and that realization left me feeling weird inside, a mix of disgust and numbness. After learning that he had been watching me, I couldn't get him out of my mind for the rest of my shift. I spent my time glancing over my shoulder or sneaking casual looks at him, trying to avoid eye contact. When my shift ended that night, My coworkers walked me part of the way home, which I appreciated. But later, when I was alone, I glanced over my shoulder and saw that same creepy older man following me from a distance. That's when I realized I was being stalked. I managed to get home, but it was distressing. I didn't know if he was just heading in the same direction or actually following me. At first, I didn't want to rely solely on my coworkers' suspicions. After all, they weren't detectives. However, I gave the man the benefit of the doubt. My thoughts changed when I went to work the next night. The creepy man had returned, and at one point, I noticed him standing uncomfortably close to the bathroom. Then, during my break, I went to a nearby convenience store and realized he was following me again. He saw me enter the store, and to my surprise, he left shortly after. Feeling relieved to be away from him, I returned to the restaurant, but there he was again, sitting in the seats outside my workplace, his eyes never leaving me. I asked my coworkers and manager to keep an eye on him in the coming days, because I still wasn't sure what to do. Chillingly, I later heard from a colleague that they had seen the stalker enter the same convenience store right after I left and buy exactly the same things I had. Apparently, he was even interested in the magazines I had picked up and flipped through. It was all piling up on me. I felt like he was there from the moment I started my shift until the moment I finished. But I didn't know what to accuse him of or how much trouble it might cause me if I did and wasn't taken seriously. At that point, I was so scared that I started dreading going to work, which I once enjoyed, and I felt anxious. My manager must have noticed how nervous I was because he filed a complaint with the security guard. The security guard approached the creepy guy, asking, "Excuse me, can you explain what you're doing?" He wasn't aggressive, but it worked. The man, visibly embarrassed, quickly left, but my relief was short-lived. The next day, the man was back, watching me and following me again. This time, my manager was furious. He went to the security guard and demanded they give the man a stern warning and tell him not to return, or they would file a police report. The security guard did just that. Once again, the man stood up and left, clearly embarrassed. I hoped the threat of a police report had done the trick, and for the first time in a long while, I had a peaceful shift, and it felt good to see the empty seats. When my shift ended that night, I headed to the parking lot to get my bike. It was always dark there, especially after a late shift. As I unlocked my bike and tried to leave, it wouldn't move. Confused, I looked back to see if the wheel was stuck on something, and that's when I saw him. My stalker was there, gripping my back tire with both hands, preventing me from leaving. It was terrifying. He seemed to have emerged from the shadows, and I hadn't even realized he was in the parking lot with me. I was so scared I couldn't make a sound. I tried pushing again, but weaker this time, knowing it wouldn't work. And then I heard him mumble something. Why? Something inside me shifted at that moment. My fear turned into anger in an instant, and I turned around and yelled at him, "What do you think you're doing? Let go of my bike." I didn't expect his response. Why? Why did you say you were going to call the police? What in the world was he thinking? His words scared me even more, highlighting how self-centered and delusional the whole thing was. It all revolved around him, with no regard for how his actions had affected me. I shouted back at him, "Because you scare me. You're frightening me. Let go of my bike." I hoped to embarrass him again, since that seemed to work before, but he yelled louder, "I never touched you. You're messing with me. You're gonna call the police just because I looked at you. Good luck with that." His selfishness was horrifying. He didn't care how his actions were affecting me. It was all about him. Fortunately, our shouting had drawn the attention of the mall security, who ran over to us. As soon as the guy saw the guards, he ran off, fleeing with his tail between his legs. After that encounter, my boss insisted on police patrols to make sure that if the man ever showed up again, he would face the authorities. Even with the police around, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might appear at any moment. I became paranoid, feeling anxious anytime someone looked at me for more than a few seconds. In the end, I had to quit that job. I enrolled in a university hundreds of miles away, and honestly, I'm glad I left before that guy showed up again. It had been the best job I ever had, even though some shifts were long and late. What I still struggle to get over after all these years is the fact that he was angry with me for wanting to report his behavior. It was a glimpse into a solipsistic world. A man without ethics telling this to a 17-year-old girl who was scared and tired of being stalked by him. "I never touched you. You're messing with me. You're going to call the police just because I looked at you." He knew what he was doing. He knew when to leave when security arrived, and he knew how to hide when the police came. He knew how to manipulate me into thinking I'd be wrong to report him. All I can say is that I'm very grateful to the people who helped me get through this situation. If it weren't for them, who knows what might have happened. This happened when I was in second grade. One morning, I was feeling pretty sick, but I still wanted to go to school. I managed to attend the first class, but they sent me home after I developed a high fever. Luckily, we lived on the same street as the school, so instead of asking my parents to leave work to pick me up, I decided to walk home by myself. To me, it was completely fine. I never worried about it since it was only a short walk. When I got home, I went straight to my room. I climbed into bed, and before I knew it, I was fast asleep. I suppose the exhaustion and fever had knocked me out. However, I was startled awake by a noise coming from downstairs. At that moment, I thought it was probably my mom returning from her part-time job or back from running some errands. Maybe the school had contacted her about my condition. Since I was awake, I thought it'd be a good idea to go downstairs and find her. I quietly descended the stairs, hoping to surprise her. It was a moment I was looking forward to, probably with a smile on my face. But as I reached the bottom, that smile vanished when I realized my mother wasn't home. Instead, there was a stranger, our neighbor, a man in his 50s who lived next door. I froze, watching him closely, and noticed he was holding a knife. When he saw me, his expression grew uneasy. Now, with the maturity I have, I realize he likely hadn't expected to find anyone there. Perhaps he thought the house would be empty, or more disturbingly, that my mother would be home alone. Before I could fully process what was happening or question the situation, the man spoke to me. "Hey, can you keep a secret?" No one needs to know I was here." My eyes stayed glued to the knife he held as he spoke. My mind, still groggy from sleep and fever, began to race. Realizing I had just woken up, I understood I was in a dangerous situation. I looked at the knife and thought, I'm in danger. I was so terrified by the gravity of the situation that all I could do was nod, unable to form any words. He smiled when I nodded, and shockingly, he turned around and left. Once he was gone, I ran to the door and locked it. I must have forgotten to lock it when I got home from school. I wanted to tell my parents what had happened, but fear overwhelmed me. I was scared that if I told them, my neighbor might hurt me. The impact of seeing that knife left me paralyzed. There was no way I could break the promise I made to him. I had to keep that secret, so I decided not to say anything to my parents. About 4 weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. However, I often thought about that neighbor, and I didn't like being home alone after school, waiting for my parents to return. Despite that, I tried to carry on. One afternoon after school, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found the same older man from next door, standing in the doorway with a bag of candy, offering it to me. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to open the door while being home alone, especially after what had happened before. I accepted the candy he offered, but I quickly shut the door behind him. After that encounter, he began showing up at my house regularly, about once a month. He always brought candy and smiled, saying, "Here you go, eat them." At the time, I couldn't understand why he kept giving me gifts. Over time, I began to suspect his intentions were more sinister, perhaps to bribe me into keeping quiet. I'm not entirely sure of his motives, but that's how it felt. Receiving candy for reasons I couldn't comprehend felt uncomfortable and disturbing. Each time I saw him smiling with those candies in hand, I couldn't help but remember the knife he had held. Once, he showed up with candy while my mother was home. I didn't want to talk to him or make eye contact. To avoid the awkwardness, my mom made excuses, saying things like, "Oh, she's just shy." She laughed, thinking my shyness was cute, but she didn't know I was keeping a dark secret about him. The months continued to pass, and eventually, I heard the news that our creepy neighbor had died. In that moment, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. My parents thought I'd be devastated by his death, since to them, it seemed like we had a connection, but in reality, I was celebrating. I didn't shed a single tear for that man. Life moved on. I grew up, moved away, and began living independently. Although I've always felt a slight unease being alone at home, that has gotten better over time. Last week I returned to my hometown, and during a neighborhood gathering with my parents, someone brought up that neighbor. The mention of him sent a chill down my spine. It was said that he loved betting on horse races and playing slot machines. Someone else commented, "Yeah, he was an alcoholic. He used to show up at our house uninvited all the time. Once I had to tell him off to make him leave." Another person added, "It's funny how all the robberies in the neighborhood stopped after he died." That's when it dawned on me that he had probably been in our house that day with the intention to steal. Or perhaps something even darker. If my mother had been home, as she often was due to her part-time job, things might have ended very differently. Maybe he was bribing me with candy to ensure I kept quiet, revealing the complex nature of his character. A thieving alcoholic who lurked in our neighborhood. I can still remember his face and the image of the knife in his hand, a memory that haunts and torments me to this day. My parents separated when I was just a little girl in kindergarten. It was a dark period in my life, filled with shadows I now try to avoid remembering. In short, I ended up living with my father, who wasn't wealthy, and our family wasn't rich either. However, I never considered ourselves poor. To me, it was just a normal, albeit bland life. This happened when I was in 6th grade, around 11 years old. After classes, I had volleyball practice, and I usually walked home. That day, my friend was sick, so I had to make the trip alone. I left school around 5 in the afternoon, an unusual time for me. Night was creeping over the landscape since it was winter, and darkness enveloped the path. The distance between the school and our apartment was about 25 minutes, and in our rural neighborhood, the lack of streetlights heightened my fear of walking alone. I tried to hurry, though the fatigue from practice weighed on me. Just 5 minutes after starting, I felt a disturbing presence. A man in his 30s was walking a few steps behind me. Normally, this wouldn't have been a big deal in broad daylight, but the darkness surrounded me, and I was completely alone. A chill ran down my spine as my heart raced, wondering if I was about to be kidnapped, just as I had heard in the news. In an attempt to calm myself, I quickened my pace, but I noticed he did too. My town was small, and after sunset, I rarely saw anyone on the street. Most people were already home, oblivious to the danger lurking. Panic washed over me. If something happened to me, no one would be there to help. No one would notice my absence. The more I allowed these terrifying thoughts to settle in my mind, the faster I walked. I was almost home when I encountered a red light at the intersection in front of our street. That's when I looked back and saw the man I thought was following me was no longer there. Relieved, I assumed I had been exaggerating, so I slowed down, crossed the street, and turned towards our apartment. But when I looked back one last time, he was there, watching me. A chill crept up my back. Frightened, I started running. I dashed up the stairs to our apartment, frantically pulling out my keys. When I finally managed to unlock the door and step inside, I felt as though the darkness was closing in on me. We lived on the 2nd floor, and I ran straight to the bedroom, cautiously opening the curtains to look outside. There he was, in the street, watching me. Terror paralyzed me, and I couldn't look away until, slowly, he moved away from our building. About 2 hours later, my father came home from work. I wanted to tell him what had happened, but I hesitated, remembering how stressed he always seemed. I chose to stay silent. A month passed, and that haunting day lingered in my mind, but nothing happened to heighten my anxiety. 2 months later, on a Sunday morning around 8, someone rang our doorbell. My father was getting ready to leave, so I went to the door and peered through the peephole. 2 men in suits stood outside. I asked who they were, and one replied they were from the city council. I opened the door, feeling confident, but as soon as I did, one of them wedged his foot in the threshold, preventing me from closing it. "It's tough having your father here," said one of the men. I didn't know what to do, so I called for my dad. When he arrived, he seemed to recognize the 2 men. He turned to me and told me to wait in the kitchen. His demeanor changed dramatically upon seeing them. I wanted to know who they were and why they needed to talk to him. I lingered in the hallway, listening. My father, aware of my presence, suggested the men speak outside. They stepped out, and he followed them, closing the door behind him. They spoke for about an hour, but I couldn't hear anything. When he finally returned, he was silent. I asked him about the men and if they were from the city council. "It's nothing. Everything is fine," he replied, and that was the last time we discussed the matter. He didn't want to talk about it any further. 3 days later, I woke up to go to school as usual. I expected to see my father hurrying around, but the apartment was too quiet. I called for him, but there was no response. I assumed he had already left, so I didn't think much of it and went to school. That night, I waited for him to come home. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. When it was 9 o'clock, I checked the refrigerator, looking for something to eat, but only found a meager dinner. Finally, I went to bed, wishing that when I woke up, everything would return to normal. The next morning, I knew before getting out of bed that my father still wasn't home. The atmosphere in the apartment felt oppressive. It was Saturday and there was no school, so I liked to sleep in, but that morning I couldn't rest without knowing where my dad was. Around 7 in the morning, I received a call from my aunt, my dad's brother's wife. "Are you okay? I'm coming to pick you up now," she said. 30 minutes later, she arrived and rang the doorbell. She told me to pack some things I would need for school. Confused, I complied. After packing, she informed me that I would be staying at her house that night. We got in the car and drove to her home. When we arrived, I saw my uncle sitting with a glass of whiskey, looking very serious. He was bald, and I thought that if my father ever lost his hair, they would look almost identical. Without any preamble, he simply said, "You'll stay here from now on. I'm sorry, but your dad isn't coming home." Crying and distressed, I kept asking why. And finally, he told me that it seemed my father had a lot of debts. As days, weeks, and months passed, I pieced together what had happened. My father had either left in the middle of the night or had been taken away by debt collectors. I was sure the man who had followed me that day was one of them, and the 2 men who came to the door, disguised as officials, were also debt collectors. All of this happened a long time ago. I haven't seen my father in 15 years, and I feel trapped in a whirlwind of emotions that I don't know how to express. I've heard rumors that he is now disabled and lives in an institution, but they are just rumors. Even if I knew where to find him, I'm not sure I would. I generally read horror stories online, and I just wanted to share mine. My father disappeared into the darkness of the night when I was in elementary school, and even if I had the chance to find him, I doubt I would have the courage to do so. I remember the day with an unsettling clarity, as if it had happened yesterday. My mind has returned to that road over and over, unable to fully grasp what happened. It was a bright Sunday, one of those days when the sun seems to promise that nothing bad can happen. I had just turned 8, and we were on our way to visit my cousins. I was excited, impatient, full of childish energy, but we never reached our destination. The accident was brutal, like a nightmare emerging from the heart of a perfect day. A car coming from the opposite direction swerved without warning. A roar of the engine, a metallic screech, and the brutal impact that destroyed everything I had known until then. I don't remember the exact moment of the crash, but the sound of crunching metal, the screams distorted by pain, and the thick, suffocating smoke have remained in my memory, as if those sounds had been imprinted in the depths of my mind. When I regained consciousness, the car was in ruins. The hood had crumpled inward, as if some monstrous force had crushed it with supernatural fury. In front of me, the windshield was a massive web of cracks, pulsating as if it had a life of its own, expanding as the silence settled. The air was dense, heavy, filled with a metallic smell that I was slow to recognize as blood. Smoke seeped through the cracks in the car, creating an unreal atmosphere, almost as if the outside world had ceased to exist. My mother was in front of me, but she wasn't moving. Her arms hung at her sides, limp, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The sound of her breathing, or its absence, never reached me. It was a still image, frozen in time, disturbing in its immobility. My grandmother was in the back seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, resting against the driver's seat. My sister lay on the floor, between the back seats, her small body in an awkward, broken position. I felt a sharp pain in my leg, but it was secondary. I couldn't take my eyes off them. Something was terribly wrong, beyond the physical. The stillness, the silence in the car, except for the occasional creaking of the twisted metal, pervaded everything. I tried to move, but a searing pain stopped me. My leg was bent at an impossible angle, trapped under the weight of the twisted metal. Despite the pain, the most terrifying thing wasn't that. It was the strange stillness around us, as if time itself had decided to stop there, on that curve of the road, on that mountain without witnesses. I realized I had to do something, anything. I started screaming, calling for help. The screams came from my throat in a desperate tone, as if my own voice didn't belong to me. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the accident, the blood, or the suffocating smoke swirling around us. It was what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. Cars passed by, one after another, slowly, as if they wanted to observe the macabre spectacle that had unfolded before them. Through the shattered windshield, I saw their faces. At first, I thought someone would stop. I looked into their eyes, with a mute plea as my screams continued. But none of them did. The fear began to turn into something else, into a kind of cold desperation, a chilling realization that we were nothing more than a curiosity, a footnote in someone else's journey. I clearly remember a family passing slowly. I saw a woman with a contained look of horror, as if she couldn't look away, but also couldn't do anything about it. Her children, in the back seats, turned to look at us as the car kept moving, their faces reflecting a mixture of fascination and fear. None of them made the slightest gesture to stop. It was as if we were part of a spectacle, a moving scene, with no reality or consequence for them. Time lost all meaning. Minutes could have passed, or it could have been hours. I screamed until my voice became a hoarse whisper, but no one came. The cars kept passing, more slowly, as the smoke became more visible. The sound of tires sliding smoothly on the road was almost deafening in its indifference. At some point, I stopped screaming. The pain in my leg became a distant presence, something that no longer felt like mine. My body was numb, but worst of all was the feeling of being completely alone, abandoned in a world that kept turning, that kept going without caring what happened to me. My mother remained motionless. My grandmother, whose body looked so small and fragile at that moment, hadn't moved since the crash. The despair was so deep I stopped feeling it. But then something happened. Just when I thought the world had forgotten about us, 2 men appeared, running down a nearby hill. Their voices broke the stillness, and their hands trembled as they tried to open the car door. I vaguely remember one of them telling me everything would be fine, but even in my state, I knew he didn't believe it. They called for an ambulance, but the time between that moment and the arrival of help was blurry, confusing, as if my mind had refused to move forward, trapped in that moment of terror. Finally, the paramedics arrived. They worked quickly, their movements efficient, but in their eyes, I saw the same expression I had seen in the drivers who passed by. There was something in them, something dark, a void of compassion that I couldn't understand. They pulled us out of the car, one by one, and that's when I realized the truth. My grandmother would never move again. She died there, in silence, while the world kept turning, while people passed by without stopping, indifferent to the tragedy that had unfolded before them. The couple who crashed into us survived. I remember seeing the driver in the hospital, his face red, swollen, with a foolish grin that made my stomach turn. "Oh, you made it," he said with a nonchalance that left me breathless. There was no trace of remorse, as if the accident had been a small detour in his day, an inconvenience of no consequence. His indifference, like that of all those who ignored us, was what left the deepest mark on me. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what happened. I tell myself maybe they were scared, that they didn't know how to react, but I can't shake the feeling that I saw something else that day, something much darker. A part of humanity that most prefer not to admit exists. It wasn't the accident that scarred me, not even the loss of my grandmother. It was the emptiness, the cold indifference of a world that simply moved on. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see those cars, the faces in the windows, watching us with the same distant curiosity one might have while looking at a crack in the pavement. I wonder if they remember, if they ever think of the little girl screaming for help as the smoke rose into the blue sky, ignored by everyone. Maybe for them, it was just another day. For me, it was the moment I discovered that the real horror doesn't lie in physical pain or death, but in the void left by human indifference. This happened when I was in elementary school, but I will never forget it. I grew up in the outskirts of Osaka, in a neighborhood that wasn't very nice. We lived in an apartment block, though I guess it was all we could afford at the time. The building was old and a bit unsafe, but it was home. In fact, on the ground floor, there was a restaurant, a Chinese place, that didn't have the best reputation. I overheard the adults in my family and others in the neighborhood talking about it from time to time, and they never had anything good to say. They said it was dirty, and honestly, it looked dirty. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was the restaurant owner's son. We were about the same age, both in elementary school, though he didn't go to mine, and I'm not even sure he went to school at all. Now that I think about it, I never saw him in a uniform, and he always seemed to be wearing the same raggedy shirt and pants. I saw him bothering other kids in the area, especially those who had learning difficulties, and it really bothered me. I also saw him chasing a cat with a stick, trying to hit it. From the very beginning, I had the worst impression of that boy, and honestly, I hated him. He made me feel deeply uncomfortable. And if you don't hate him yet, let me tell you something more. One afternoon after school, I was playing with a couple of friends near our building. There were 4 of us. Out of nowhere, the boy from the restaurant appeared with his stick. I didn't notice him coming, and I only realized he was there when I felt him lift my skirt. I turned around in shock, and my friends stood there, mouths agape. I found myself face to face with that boy. I yelled something like, "What do you think you're doing?" He stared straight into my eyes, not ashamed at all for being caught doing something he shouldn't. He wasn't angry, he looked irritated at my reaction and made a tch sound. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I just kicked him with my right foot as hard as I could, and he hit the ground with a dull thud and a groan of pain. He looked up at me, expecting me to lash out, but instead, he smiled. A smile so unsettling that I knew, right then, I needed to avoid that boy at all costs. From that point on, whenever I played with my friends, if I ever saw the restaurant boy, I did everything I could to steer clear of him. We even started playing in areas farther from home just in case we ran into him. But then he started showing up in other places. He always seemed to find our little group. Of course, whenever we spotted him, we'd move away. Sometimes, he'd sneak up on us without us even noticing. Eventually, he seemed to lose interest in bothering us and kept to himself. So we stopped avoiding the park. He didn't bother us, and we didn't bother him. We loved playing on this slide that wasn't just any slide. It was huge, with tunnels where you could pick up real speed, and it was shaped like a whale. We thought it was the coolest thing ever. One day, when we got there and climbed the stairs to the top of the slide, we noticed 4 juice bottles sitting there. There was a note under the bottles, scribbled on a torn piece of paper that said, "Free, please take," written in terrible handwriting. One of my friends started cheering, saying stuff like, "Wow, we got something for free." But I was more cautious. My parents had always warned me not to pick up things from the street, and this felt like one of those situations. So, I didn't want anything to do with it. One of my friends, Maya, said something like, "What are you worried about? It's for us," and grabbed a bottle of juice. 2 of my other friends followed suit, and suddenly, I felt like a party pooper for not joining them. Each one grabbed a bottle, and they called out to me, asking if I was sure I didn't want one. Maya gave me a look, annoyed that I wasn't going along with it. She twisted the cap off her bottle and was the first to start drinking, tilting her head back. She took about 3 gulps before it happened. She bent forward and started spewing the juice, or more like vomiting it, out in a wild spray, like something out of an exorcism movie. Then she began coughing violently, and we all laughed, saying that's what she got for drinking so fast. But there was a problem. She didn't stop coughing. We all stared at her, collectively thinking, "Okay, enough already." Finally, I broke the silence and asked, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She just kept coughing and gasping. It wasn't funny anymore. She was spitting, and when I saw the spit hit the ground, it was brown. I looked at her, and there was this brown, foamy spit dribbling from the corners of her mouth. Something was very wrong. We all started screaming, panic hitting us like a wave. We were all yelling, trying to get Maya's attention, each of us wanting her to say she was okay. Maya looked at us, clutching her chest, and the last thing we heard her say was, "Hot, hot, Mom," as she flailed. An older woman who saw us crying and screaming ran over and asked what had happened. All we could tell her was that Maya drank the juice we found at the top of the slide. As we panicked and explained, we saw the woman's face fill with horror. She pulled a phone from her bag and called an ambulance. We, being little kids, could do nothing but freak out. But in the middle of all this chaos, I felt a strange urge to look away, as if someone was watching us. I turned, and there he was, the restaurant boy. He was crouching behind some bushes in the park. It was summer, and the grass was taller than usual. He was squatting, watching our panic, smiling like he was so pleased with himself. My other 2 friends, of course, Maya didn't notice him, but I did. And as soon as he realized I'd seen him, he took off running. Moments later, the ambulance arrived for Maya. My parents and the paramedics asked me very serious questions, but I couldn't answer. Everything was a blur. I was so terrified for my friend that I thought when they took her away in that ambulance, it might be the last time I ever saw her. Luckily, that wasn't the case. She recovered and came back to school after a week or 2. We later found out that the juice she drank wasn't just juice. It had been mixed with pesticides. No one knew who had put those bottles on the slide. I kept hearing words like random and no motive being thrown around. In the end, they never caught the person who left the poison juice on the slide, but I knew who had done it. I just couldn't prove it. I was a child and didn't know what to do about it. I was just relieved that Maya was back at school and safe. I guess I was also a little scared to tell anyone my theory about who did it. I was afraid that if I told someone, he'd try to hurt me or my friends again. We all got a lecture about not touching things that don't belong to us or accepting gifts from strangers, and a few months later, the restaurant downstairs from our building closed down or moved. I'm not sure which. It became a convenience store, I think. No one missed that restaurant or that family. Honestly, I have no idea where that boy went. I just know that he probably didn't stop there and might be doing worse things than poisoning little girls in a park. For as long as I can remember, I've always felt a strange connection to water. I grew up in a small coastal town in Japan, specifically in Shirahama, where the sea breeze accompanied me on my walks to school. The waves gently broke against the shore, and the fishermen often brought back stories of what lay beneath the surface. However, everything changed the day I discovered an old videotape in my grandmother's house, one of those traditional Japanese homes with its tiled roof and paper shoji walls. It was a hot, sticky summer afternoon, with the scent of salt water thick in the air. As I browsed through the dusty shelves, I came across an ancient box. Inside was a videotape, the kind my grandmother used to watch in her youth. Curious, I decided to play the tape on the old VCR in my room. The images were unsettling. A dark well, a figure in black and white with long, disheveled hair, and whispers that filled the room like the echo of an ancient mantra. I didn't understand its meaning, but a cold chill ran through me. At the end of the footage, a whispering voice said, "7 days." That phrase lingered in my mind like a whisper from the beyond. At school, my small group of friends mocked me when I told them about the tape. "It's just a horror movie," they said, laughing and dismissing my fears. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. That night, after watching the tape, I dreamed of the well. In my dream, I felt someone watching me from the depths, their dark, hollow eyes filled with resentment. When I woke up, my bed was soaked, as if someone had been crying over me. As the days passed, strange things started happening. I saw shadows moving in the reflection of the water at the local temple pond, the Kumano Nachi temple, where families went to offer prayers for health and happiness. I heard whispers in the waves, like the distant singing of sirens. I decided to investigate the story behind the tape. There was a myth about a girl named Sadako, abandoned in a well in a village near Kumamoto, whose vengeance haunted those who saw her. Fear gripped me. 7 days after watching the tape, I found myself on the beach in Shirahama. The moon shone brightly over the water, and the wind howled like a lone wolf. I felt an irresistible pull toward the sea. As I approached, I heard her name. Sadako. It was a distant echo, yet familiar. My heart raced as I waded into the water, an icy chill enveloping me. And there she was, an ethereal figure with deep, sorrowful eyes. Her face reflected a mix of pain and longing. "You found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if it came from the ocean's depths. She told me she had been trapped in the well, seeking release, but also revenge. She offered me a deal. If I could pass her curse to another person, she could be freed. A wave of anguish washed over me. I couldn't do it. Sacrificing someone else was something I couldn't bear. The next morning, I woke up on the beach, covered in sand. My mind was muddled, images of Sadako dancing in my head. Reality and dreams blurred together. I decided to tell my best friend Yuki about what I had seen, hoping she could help me find a solution. But before I could say anything, I saw her pale face, her eyes distant. She had seen the tape. Time was running out. Guilt consumed me, as if the curse was shifting from me to her. I spent the following days searching for answers. I wandered through the old town, asking elders in the small shops along the main street, where paper lanterns glowed and the scent of yakitori filled the air. Finally, I found an old man in a small Shinto shrine. He was the keeper of the legend, and his wise gaze gave me hope. He told me of the sacrifice Sadako needed to be freed. Someone had to face their deepest fears. The thought of risking another person horrified me, but I knew I couldn't stand by and do nothing. So, once again, I returned to the beach at dusk, as the tide began to rise, and the sky burned red as if the sun were on fire. "Sadako," I called, "I'll help you." The water bubbled, and the figure appeared once more. This time I felt her sorrow. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I can't let someone else suffer." At that moment, the sky darkened, and a storm erupted. The sea roared like a wild beast, and the waves crashed against the shore. But I knew I had to confront my own fears. "I'm here for you," I told Sadako. "I won't forget you. Your story will live on through me." Sadako's figure faded into the mist of the water, and the weight on my chest lifted. The curse's hold on me vanished. I knew I had risked much, but I also realized that I couldn't let fear control my life. At dawn, the sun rose over the horizon, and the water looked calm. Everything seemed to have returned to normal. Since that day, water has never been the same for me. Every wave, every reflection in the sea reminds me of Sadako and the lesson I learned. Some stories must be told, not to spread fear, but to find peace. I started visiting the Kumano Nachi temple more often, lighting incense and making offerings in Sadako's honor, asking never to forget the sacrifice I had made. As the months passed, the town came back to life, but within me, I would always carry a part of Sadako's story. Somehow, I felt connected to her, as if a part of her spirit had found a home in me. The water, once a place of terror, became a refuge, a reminder that though darkness may lurk, there is always light waiting to be found. The town where I grew up has always been surrounded by ghost stories and urban legends. One of the creepiest was about the house in the Mizukawa neighborhood, a place that had been abandoned for years. It was said that whoever entered it never came out the same. Adults often whispered warnings, but the curiosity of children always prevailed. One afternoon, during summer vacation, my friends and I decided it was time to unravel the mystery. My name is Akiko, and I'm 13 years old. With me were Yuto, my best friend since childhood, and Hana, a bold girl who always led our mischief. The Mizukawa house stood at the end of a narrow alley, overgrown with weeds and its windows thick with dust. As we approached, a shiver ran down my spine, but the thrill outweighed my fear. We entered through the back door, which creaked ominously, as if the house itself were warning us to stay away. The inside was even more terrifying than I had imagined. The walls were covered in mold, and the air reeked of dampness and decay. As we explored, we found old objects, a cracked vase, dusty toys, and a framed photograph of a family that seemed to stare at us with sadness. Yuto joked about how haunted the house was, and we tried to laugh to calm our nerves. Suddenly, a dull thud echoed from upstairs, like something heavy had fallen. We glanced at each other, our hearts pounding. Hana, impulsive as always, suggested we go up and check. The stairs groaned beneath our weight, each step pulling us deeper into the darkness. When we reached the second floor, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The shadows seemed to shift, and sunlight barely penetrated through the cobweb-covered windows. In one of the rooms, we found a door slightly ajar. Without thinking, I pushed it open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, except for an old mirror covered in dust. As we approached, I saw a figure behind us, reflected in the glass. It was a woman with long, dark hair hanging over her face, and her gaze was hollow, lifeless. I screamed and spun around, but no one was there. My friends laughed, thinking I was joking. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As we explored further, we found a worn-out diary in a corner. It was filled with scribbles, but one entry caught my eye. The darkness consumes me. The house never forgets. A deep unease settled over me, as if the house was alive, and not in a friendly way. As day turned to night, we decided it was time to leave. But before we could go, we heard a whisper, "Help me." It was distant, but it echoed in my mind. I looked at my friends, trying to dismiss it, but their faces told me they had heard it too. We went home, but the unease never left me. That night, I had a disturbing dream. In it, the woman from the mirror stood in the corner of my room, her empty eyes staring directly at me. I woke up with a scream, my heart racing. Her image was burned into my mind. The following days were strange. I began to notice that everything in my daily life felt off. My friends seemed distant, and I always had the sensation that someone was watching me. A heavy sadness hung over me, and the whisper, "Help me," echoed in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I decided to return to the Mizukawa house. This time, I went alone, feeling that I had to confront whatever I had found. When I arrived, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. Summoning all my courage, I climbed the stairs, the echo of my footsteps filling the silence. I entered the room with the mirror, and there she was again, reflected in the glass, closer than before. "Why won't you help me?" Her voice was a heartbreaking whisper that echoed in my chest. I realized then that the woman had been trapped in the house, a restless spirit in need of release. Without thinking, I shouted, "I'll help you!" Suddenly, the mirror began to tremble, and a dark shadow emerged from it, enveloping me. A wave of cold washed over me. I closed my eyes and remembered the stories I'd heard about spirits. "You're not alone. Find peace," I said aloud. The atmosphere shifted. The shadow began to fade, and the woman smiled, her face filled with gratitude. In that moment, I felt a great weight lift from my chest. I opened my eyes, and the mirror was empty. The house felt less oppressive, as if a burden had been lifted. I stepped outside, and the cool breeze welcomed me. From that day on, I never heard the whisper again, nor did I feel that unsettling presence. I had freed the woman trapped in the Mizukawa house, and though I would never know who she truly was, her spirit had found the peace she so desperately sought. As I returned home, I felt changed. The experience taught me that sometimes, facing our fears is the first step toward freeing ourselves from the shadows that haunt us. The stories we tell aren't always just legends. Sometimes they're warnings we should heed.